Yeah, everybody give it up for Randall Fireside Sawmill.
Hey, thank you.
We're going to some really nifty needle stuff about logs and lumber and fun things like that.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have lots of time for Q&A afterwards. But I wanted to just kind of give you a 1.0 introduction to what makes a good saw log. And so I think that the first thing to say is just that the value of a saw log is relative to its use. There is something usable in every single log. So if I say something like sweet gum is not valuable, there's clearly a use for sweet gum. But the early lumber graders might have been the hominid who was making spears out of it. And so I thought that maybe we could go through the important milestones in lumber grading. Back in the earliest phase, the question, of course, was can I make a spear or a boomerang out of it? And then that slowly evolved into if I built a fort out of it, would it protect me from vandals? And so the earliest Bronze Age sawmills were actually the giant wedges that people were using to split. So before we had saws, we had wedges splitting things into big timbers. And then moving into it, 1592 was the first time we ever had a sawmill. It was actually run by a giant windmill, kind of an up-down saw motion. And then once you get into the early 20th century, you start to have actual sawmill and grading. So those were the first time that you had systematic rules. And those were basically, does it look like a cylinder, like a 9-year-old drew it? So it's just a round log, fewest knots possible. Can we put it through our giant factories? Moving into like the period that you might call like the urban lumber movement. Can I fill it with resin? Can I put my Lego men in it? Seems to be the key question. And then my value for a log is can I cut it up and sell it and buy seeds with it as a farmer? So all of these values, so to speak, for logs are relative to the potential use. But like on a truthful note, like what my business does is I'm looking at the ways to divert logs from the waste stream and convert them into affordable home materials. Because the bigger systemic issue that we're having is that over 7 billion board feet of urban lumber material is going into the landfills every year in the US. These are all logs and materials that could be converted into home construction materials. And so the question is, how do we build a commodity chain to be able to do that? I think you're looking at that as one problem related to, say, climate change, because when all those logs go into the landfill, they're off-gassing CO2 and methane. We could be sequestering that carbon as building materials. And in the process of doing that, solving another problem, which is affordable housing. So at least locally in North Carolina, we know that we need over 1 million homes added into our supply over the next 10 years. Around here, for example, home prices are over $600,000 per home. And so it's just how do we build more affordable homes? And I think urban lumber is actually the key to that. So that's kind of what my business is looking at doing, setting up a facility outside of Saxbahaw, bringing in logs, turning into materials, and then selling them for affordable homes. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what are the traditional standards, and then we can talk about breaking the rules. But in most cases, when we talk about hardwoods, a saw log, 12 inches in diameter, and the key is the length. When you see log trucks rolling up and down the road, a lot of those logs are bucked at 12'6". That's kind of an industry standard. That 6 inches is just a little bit of margin of error. So if your saw is not quite sharpened correctly, you can take off that inch and it's not going to be a demerit at the sawmill. So it's not an exact. Also, when I'm a sawyer and I go to dry it, if there's end checking that comes in and ruins the like 2 inches on the end of the log, I can still sell that as a 12-foot board. Highest value species, this is from a market perspective. Obviously your walnuts, your cherries, white oak is really hot right now. A lot of the white oaks are going up to Virginia to stave mills where they're turned into whiskey barrels. Medium value logs, of course, are your sycamores, your ashes, your hickories. And I don't see much demand for sweet gum or elm, both because when you mill them, they move a lot, they tend to bend. Best use for sweet gum, for example, is you can use it for cross ties and things like that. So I thought it would be interesting for you to know that when you see log trucks moving up and down 54, a lot of those hardwoods are headed out to Liberty, where there's Edwards Forest Products, where I think they produce 40 million board feet per year. They're processing 180,000 board feet per day. It's a gigantic operation. And then from there, a lot of those 1-inch boards are then kiln dried in their neighboring facility and then shipped to Vietnam, which is one of the biggest furniture producing countries in the world. And then that furniture is then shipped out across to the world. So that's a lot of the kind of commodity chain for hardwood lumber locally. And so here's a good example of a top-notch saw log. The pith is centered, there are no knots on it, and it requires at least 3 people on the back end of the mini skid to be able to load. That's a good saw log. Okay, so a good saw log in terms of pine, they're traditionally bucked at 12/6 and 16/6. Also clear, no knots. And then the smaller stuff, when you see the big chip trucks rolling in, those are smaller diameter, those get turned into your OSB. The biggest plant around here is New South in Camphor, south of Graham. And your larger diameter logs, they are traditionally milled into veneer. What I use for lumber, they use for veneer. So larger diameter clear.
Randall, what is OSB?
Boy, I don't know what the acronym stands for, but you know the 4x8 sheets that look like a collage of just bark chips that are compressed and glued together.
Engineered structural components.
These are some great examples. Who did this job? This was out toward Pittsburgh. These are some beautiful saw logs at Clayton Neal's place. Absolutely stunning pines. Not a knot in them. 24-inch diameter. Absolutely gorgeous. So what are the non-traditional lumber standards for the urban lumber movement? You know, the urban lumber movement has kind of upended what's a valuable log because the funky, weird stuff with curves and voids and holes and stuff is suddenly valuable, and the story of the wood has become a part of its value. So when you get something that comes down from UNC and it's a giant crotch section that's 50 inches across at the top, that has a new value that it didn't, say, 60 years ago. And so the urban lumber movement, of course, is reaching a point at which it's all about what you can pour in the epoxy: Star Wars figurines, poker chips, bullet casings. So I'm not doing a lot of the river table stuff. My interest is in affordable homes, but you should know that those sections are at least valuable to someone. So this is a good example of a good live edge slab. Can't remember who worked on this job, but this was a big ash that y'all cut down. I think it was over near Irwin Road. Big, beautiful, wide ash. Mike Skillen, I think, helped on that job. So what am I interested in? Obviously, the stuff that I can turn into housing materials. And what's nice about a tiny home is that I can use lots of different things. So if you bring me hickory, I can turn that into flooring, or white oak or red oak. A house is a very versatile wood structure. So I can use anything over 12 inches in diameter, anything over 8/6. Yeah, I don't have a lot of use for sweet gums, but Kate's Sawmill over in Efland, you might see them running down the road with a bunch of big beams every single day. They stop for biscuits in White Cross, 7x9x9s. The railroad industry is 6 million railroad ties short, so that's an infinite market for any kind of hardwoods. So, talk about common defects. Once you inspect the length of the log, what are some things that would disqualify it as a saw log? Obviously, if there's a wound in it, particularly if it's pine, you can see kind of an indentation, any kind of cracks from a hard fall, from a lightning strike. If that lightning has moved through the log diagonally in a weird path, I can't really salvage much from it. The exception was that Buckhorn Road white oak that y'all did, where I was able to mill it down into little 1x2 strips. Thousands of them, hundreds of them. And then I have a picture of pines. When I get a pine in, it has knots, it usually goes into siding. When I have a pine come in and it's clear, it goes into framing lumber. And so this is kind of a good example, framing and siding. And then inside, a really pitchy pine, if you see some type of oozy sap on the outside, invariably the interior is going to have this thick sap that renders it unusable.
What makes it unusable about, like why does that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I have some deck boards that were pitchy like that, and the problem is, one, it heats up the blade and gets sticky when I'm milling it, but then I have a friend who milled some pitchy pine and turned them into benches for his wedding venue. And then all of a sudden, when it heated up, everybody in a sundress stuck to it.
I mean, that's one way to make sure the guests stay longer.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Are you sometimes surprised by finding a lot of pitch internal to it, or is it always kind of exuding from the outside?
Yeah, I think that the pitch tells the story of the tree. If there was any point in its evolution that it was injured or stressed, you might find a really pitchy interior of the pine, but not see anything on the outside. So, yeah. And that's also true. You can have a really clear diameter, clear pine, and then find vestigial branches on the inside once you start to mill it.
Yeah. Sometimes you can find like really high quality fat wood.
Yeah. It is very. Yeah, there are moments. I forget who did this with me. I cut a pine that was really pitchy. Sap was pouring out of an orifice. He took his lighter right to it, and it ignited, pouring out of the tree. Crosscut inspection. Once you buck the log and you're looking at the crosscut, what are some common defects? So as you guys know, I don't need to tell you how to identify metal in the wood. So any kind of blue stain, the capillary system of the tree is pushing that blue stain laterally through the tree, so you can usually tell where it is. Most of the time it's at 4 and 5 feet, and it's some kind of fence staple, eye hook, something like that in it. Also on a crosscut, you might see heart rot. Maples just need a reason to die, so they'll tend to become really punky in the center. You'll have separation on the outside of the kind of sapwood area and the heartwood area. I think I have some illustrations for this, where you start to get heart rot. This is called shake, where the interior and the exterior starts to separate. I can't really do much with that. That's actually a bacteria. People have recently learned that that's a bacterial infection of the tree to make that separation. And then when you get a fall, like if the tree comes down super hard, that can have a diagonal cut, and then I can't salvage anything from the tree. Let me see if I got to all of those. Hollow piths. I mean, when you get your larger diameter oaks in particular, I'm not going to be able to salvage the pith anyway. So a little bit of holes in the center there is a non-issue. A lot of times, early sawyers just threw that center section away. And of course, bark inclusion. When you get a codominant tree and the tree is grown in such a way that the two stems are growing over that center point, that center vacuous hollow section will actually not be usable for me either. And then I just focus on the two stems. Okay, awesome. So that was like the 1.0 version, and I wanted to have enough time to do a couple minutes of questions, because I know you'll have, yeah.
At present, is there a way for a homeowner to recoup some of the cost of removal through selling wood, or is that not feasible? And do you see a time where that might be feasible?
In the case of walnut, yes, always. Or larger diameter walnuts always could significantly offset the cost of tree work. Most of the time, the answer is no, because the value of logs on the open marketplace is so low. So if I as a sawyer can go to the open market and buy a white oak log at $60 to $100 a ton and have it brought to me for $100, then I'm going to choose to do that and bring in the logs rather than bring all my equipment out and buy it from a landowner. Most sawmills have very expensive blades, and urban logs tend to have metal in them, and so most large volume buyers won't even fuss with urban trees. The highest value for the client and the homeowner is to offset lumber costs they would otherwise have. So when you look at the numbers on, say, a large stand of pines, they can save, and they have a building project in mind, the cost of milling is 60% of the cost of buying in that lumber. And so they're able to save that money by offsetting the cost that they'd have down the road. So it's a very specific situation. Also, if the client is a woodworker or is about to do a renovation, they're saving those costs.
So essentially, it saves them if they would otherwise be using the wood for a project they have.
That's right. Yeah. And I get 3 to 4 calls a day from people who ask me if I will come to their house to cut down the tree to pay myself in wood.
Same thing happens as when we have conversations.
There's
What?
like
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
really great YouTube video called was it my high value black walnut tree or something like that. It's a funny little cartoon where they go off on it. If you guys have time watching it, I can send it to you.
Yeah. And the question there was, can the clients ever make money by?
Or will there be, so for example, if your vision where these urban trees are being put more and more to use
Yeah.
to build affordable housing, might there be a future in which part of the cost of tree work could be subsidized
Yeah.
by a more local use of wood?
Yeah, I think it's also because we're in a temperate rainforest in the midst of rapid urban development where there's so much clear cutting happening all the time. So the supply is just always going to be huge. And pine plantations that were planted back in the 90s with federal incentives are all coming into fruition now. So over the next 35 years, pine prices are always going to be low. So there's just such an abundant supply. That could maybe flip if we didn't have as much supply. Yeah, yeah, good.
Are willow oaks worth it?
Great question. Are willow oaks worth it? Dude, it's great. Great question. Durham, as a part, in the 1930s, Durham planted almost 13,000 urban trees, most of which were willow oaks, all of them that are coming into kind of their maturity right now. What's that?
Did you give a date when they were doing that?
1930s. Yeah.
I think
So,
Valley did that too.
yeah.
A little bit.
And they're great shade trees until they rot out in the center and start dropping branches everywhere, right? So from a woodworker perspective, couple things. As a sawyer in the last 13 years, I've gotten calls for red oak twice. It is a low demand woodworking wood from a demand perception standpoint. As a woodworker who has worked with willow oak, it tends to have a wider grain, so it tears out a lot easier once you put it through the planer. That said, it's perfectly great for stair treads, siding, countertops, so it's all usable. But from a market perspective, no, it's not high demand.
They're like cool tables are going to be made from
Yeah,
willow. Yeah.
it's a very dramatic and busy wood. So it has a very rustic, heavy feel to it.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
That's cool.
How much, if at all, does time of year of the tree harvest affect
Yeah.
your milling and drying of the wood?
Oh, yeah.
And the sap content, I guess, if you're talking about with time.
Yeah, so it matters a lot with pine. I mean, I mill pine year round, but old timers will say that the first full moon of March is when the sap runs. And so wood becomes heavier and more pitchy through the summertime. Wintertime is a delight to mill pine because the humidity is low. You stack it without a lot of blue stain. Starting in April and moving in through the summer, it is very hard to dry pine in such a way that it doesn't blue stain. So that pine, it does have a big impact. Other questions? Yeah.
I have one. Similar to the paying yourself with wood
Yeah.
joke, are there any common myths or misconceptions about the services you offer that we could help dissuade when we talk to any common questions that you get that you're like, man, I really wish more people knew the answer to that?
Yeah, the question is, are there common misunderstandings, misconceptions around my services that you could help me dispel? Milling is not right for everybody, but it's an awesome option for the right client. I see it as a zero-sum thing where if somebody has $1,000 to spend on something else, they should use that unless they really need $2,000 in lumber, you know. So the first question is always, will you use it? What will you use it for? Will it be of value to you in the future? Because sometimes I drive up and down 54 where I have had 5 different clients, only 2 of whom have stacked the lumber once I've left, and that kind of breaks my heart, you know. So there's a lot of kind of follow-up that a client has to do to make it a value. Yeah.
I had a question for you. What would be something that just really irritates you? Like we bring you something and you're like, why did they bring this to me?
Yeah.
What would something we could avoid and, to not mess you up?
The question is, what could you ever bring to me that would irritate me and mess me up? I think when you look at research on urban lumber, the biggest question is around mixed loads. And that's an interesting problem to me because the way that the product comes in is you have your saw logs, you have your branches, then you have your mulch chips. And you need a one and done drop spot for all 3 so that you can be efficient. Arborists don't have the luxury of time to begin sorting things out on the log yard at the end of the day. It's more like pull in, you're exhausted, everything's in the truck, rest, unload, start the next day. So from a workflow perspective, it's very important to me to figure out a way that I can do that sorting at my new facility. So you can come in with the mixed loads, and because I have an eye for a saw log that's different, and so I can separate them, and then the firewood can then go to a firewood producer or to farmers who I know who are heating their greenhouses with firewood, and mulch can go in one spot. So the answer is I would err on the side of bringing it to me and let me figure it out.
Okay.
And I'll hide my irritation if I feel it.
We got time for one more question, guys. Craig, did you have something?
I just think fantastic what Randall has done here at the Fireside Sawmill.
Yeah.
You had a background in education.
Yeah. Yeah, torturing kids with presentations like these. Yeah.
Your wife is doing a cut flower farm and just doing it on your own. Keep an eye on Randall.
Yeah.
I think you probably see a lot of opportunity for kind of adjacent sort of businesses when you talk to clients, or
Yes.
that people want.
Yep.
But that no one's doing, or
Yeah.
maybe market opportunities. Maybe if you have some ideas for like what are things like, a lot of guys want to get into this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like pole turning or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you see some holes in the market where if one of our guys wanted to start a little side business?
Yes.
What might they get into?
There's data out there on the return on investment for urban lumber, and it's an inverted graph where slabs and lumber are high, but firewood is comparable. So I think that there's a good market for firewood. I think that there are changes in the home building construction market right now that are dissuading people from using gas stoves, and people are more focused on self-sufficiency, and also building more masonry stoves in new construction. So I think the firewood market is increasing, and then I think that there's a whole opportunity for custom woodworks and carpentry with salvage lumber that we haven't even begun to tap into as more DIY cultures take foot. And I envision my sawmill as being a place where I can have things like Free Fridays, where people can come and pull from my scrap pile, because I'm looking at it sometimes and I realize that that could launch an entire carpenter or woodworker's business. And I want to be able to do that, but that's why I needed a facility first. Yeah.
Randall, is there anything else you want to leave us with that we can help you with your adventure?
Yeah, I get texts and pictures all day long, and it's my preferred method of communication. So if you snap a picture at a log and you say, is this good, or something like that, I will not be upset, and I will respond as quickly as I can. So feel free.
Is that number a cell, or is that a landline?
Yeah, that's this number. It's the cell. So feel free to text me anytime.
Randall, thank you so much.
Thank you.